Ahoy there, this is Brandon Wright with Barnacle Systems. Today we're going to go over the settings page on the Barnacle app. Now first things first, make sure that you've got a Barnacle installed on your boat so that you're calibrating and setting up all the sensors the way that it would be when it's on board your vessel. Now to start off, to get to the settings page on the Barnacle app, simply click on Settings. Now once you're in, you're going to see a bunch of default settings, but in here we can see that we've made some modifications here to speed things up. So first is the camera settings. The capture hour 1, 2, 3, those simply mean that this is the hours that you're going to get your 3 scheduled photos from your camera. Now this only applies if you have a Barnacle camera on board your boat. So here the default is 0, 1, and 2. That means midnight, 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. So this is all set up in military time. So if you'd like to have a photo taken at noon, you can pick 12. If you want a photo taken at 5 p.m., you could pick 17. Click OK. Next is the camera rotation. So in this situation, we've actually got a Barnacle mate connected where we have 2 cameras connected. So first camera we have set up with 90-degree rotation. That means that our camera is actually rotated 90 degrees in its mounting position. The default being 0. But if you mount the camera sideways or upside down, you can set it to 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 270 degrees. Next is the map settings. This is for setting up how many GPS points you want to display on your map, whether or not you'd like to show the location track, which is the red line behind where your boat has been, or you can also set up the units, feet or meters, for your geofence. Now if we scroll down here, we can actually see that we have max GPS points as 1,000. We have our GPS history start. So you can see here that our GPS history is going to start on June 22nd, 2021 at 9:22 a.m. So this was set up based off of when the unit was installed. The GPS coordinates are set to decimal degrees. They can be set to degrees, minutes, seconds if you prefer. As well, you can turn on and off location tracks. The location tracks is the breadcrumb behind your boat. So as you go on a trip, it will draw a red line behind it when this is enabled. Then the preferred unit is set to feet for this vessel. Next are the battery inputs. So by default, the names are battery 1, battery 2, battery 3, and battery 4. Now, you see here we have tabs called Monitor and Alert. Monitor is where you can show or hide the tile on the Barnacle app. So if it's turned on, that means that you are monitoring this input. And if the alert toggle is on, that means that you can get an alert when the Barnacle system is armed. Next, you can change the name of your input. So right now it default to battery 1. Let's change it to house battery. Now, next is decimal places. I prefer to have 1 decimal place personally, but you can have up to 4 decimal places of accuracy or precision on a battery input. Next is the offset. So if your battery is reading slightly different from a voltmeter on board your vessel versus what you're seeing in the Barnacle app, you can add an offset. This is usually due to voltage drop in small gauge wires that are run over a long distance. So you might see a 0.1 or a 0.2 volt difference. Don't worry about that. That's literally just something involving physics that changes the battery voltage that you might see in the Barnacle versus a voltmeter located somewhere else on board your boat. But if you'd like to synchronize them, you can enter in a positive or negative number here that allows the offset. Next is your maximum minimum values. These are your alert values for the Barnacle. So for a 12 volt battery, I actually recommend having something along the lines of 15.5 volts so that the batteries aren't getting overcharged. And then a minimum value, I actually prefer to have 12 volts for my 12 volt DC batteries. That way, if it gets down to 12 volts, I know I should get it charged fairly soon before it becomes a problem. If you have a 24 volt system, simply double these numbers. So you could look at having 31 volts as your high value and then 24 volts as your low value. All right, so now battery inputs 2, 3, and 4 are slightly different than battery input 1. You can actually use these for something other than battery monitoring. So we have an analog sensor type dropdown. By default, they're batteries, but you could add a bilge pump, an ignition, or other into one of these inputs. The bilge input automatically changes the name to Bilge, has the offset, and then as well it has a trigger value. The trigger value is simply the value or in volts of what you would be triggering high or low. So if it's below 5 volts, that would be considered low. If it's above 5 volts, that would be considered high. This could be changed to 4 volts, could be changed to 8 volts. It's totally up to you for your particular use case. And when it's high with the bilge pump, we named it pumping by default. And when it's low, it's named as OK. And then if you want to receive alerts from this input, you can set the alert on high or the alert on low. As well, it can be set up as an ignition, which is essentially just counting your engine hours. So if you'd like to monitor your ignition, turn on monitor and alert. The name can be ignition, it could be engine hours, whatever you'd like. Again, a trigger value. So if the voltage of this input goes above 5 volts, you will begin counting engine hours. The high name is on, the low name is off. These, of course, can be renamed. The current engine hours, if you already know that, say, your engine has 1,000 hours on it, you could just set it to 1,000 hours, and then it'll begin counting from there. And if you'd like to get an alert when the ignition is turned on, make sure that you have alerts enabled, and then you can set alert on ignition on. Then the last option is other. This is just a generic input where you can change it so that it could be monitoring anything else. This could be generators, it could be another analog input, or even a digital input. It doesn't really matter. You can set it so that it's triggering again above or below 5 volts or whatever your value is, on, off, and alert on high or low. Now once you've configured your battery inputs, next is the dedicated bilge input. This dedicated bilge input is by far the most complex of all our inputs, simply because we know that you don't want to just be alerted based on how long a bilge pump's been on, but also how frequently that bilge pump's been running. So first, you want to turn on monitor, and you'll want to turn on alert. You can change the name, so it could be your engine bilge pump, or it could be your aft or mid, totally up to you. Now the long period alert, essentially what this is doing is saying, over the course of 24 hours, if my bilge pump runs 10 times, I want to get an alert. So for you, if it's a dry boat that you're on, you might want this to actually be that if your bilge pump runs twice in 24 hours or 3 times in 24 hours. The short period alert is how many times it runs over, say, 30 minutes. So in this case, it defaults to if your bilge pump runs 3 times in 30 minutes, I want to get an alert. So this can all be modified if you want it to be over the course of an hour or over the course of a few minutes. You can set that up as well. Then the bilge on time limit, this is for duration. So if you want to get an alert because your bilge pump has run for more than 10 seconds, by default it's set up for 60 seconds. You can modify this input. So this input, like I said, defaults to 60 seconds. We could set it to 10 seconds, and then this allows you to get an alert if your bilge pump runs for longer than 10 seconds. The default for high name is on. You can set it to pumping, you could set it to alert, you could set it to whatever you'd like. And for us, we'll say pumping, and then we'll put the low name as OK. And that's the bilge input on the Barnacle settings. So next in line are the digital inputs. These are switching ground inputs, but the most common use case is for monitoring bilge pumps. If you do want to monitor a bilge pump using one of these digital inputs, you do require a 12 or 24 volt DC relay. We do sell them as DC device controllers through the Barnacle store or through one of our certified dealers. Now, if you're going to use a digital input, you turn on monitor, you turn on alert, you rename the sensor. So we'll call this one a bilge here. So we'll just rename to, say, aft bilge, the high name as pumping, then the low name as OK. There we go. And then we want to alert on high. So you see here that we have the alert on high and a delay time. If you want this bilge to be able to run for 5 seconds or 10 seconds without being a notification to you, you can set this delay time. So for example, say we expect that this bilge pump's going to run for 1 second periodically and we're not worried about it. So let's set our delay time to 5 seconds. which means that if this bilge pump runs for more than 5 seconds, I want to get an alert. If you want to generate a photograph based off of this event, you simply turn on photo on alert. And if you want it to turn on a siren, strobe lights, or something that's connected to one of your outputs, simply choose output on alert and then pick which output you have it wired to. So in this case, we'll trigger output 1. This is similar for a wired door sensor. This is one of the Barnacle accessories that we support, where if you want to get a wired door sensor and generate an alert and trigger photograph, you could set this one up as a door sensor. In order to do that, we'll rename it to be a door sensor. We'll change this here to door sensor. With a door sensor, they are actually reversed in the sense that the door sensor, when it's closed, it's considered high, and that's the closed state. So we'll say closed for the high name, and then for low, we will say open. Then we actually want to alert on low. So when the door is open, it's actually a magnet inside, so it's going to say that it's open when it's in a low state. Then the delay time, this is the time between when the door is open and when a photograph is taken. So if you've got a hatch where you're actually pulling boards or flipping open a hatch like a window, you can have it have a, say, a 10-second delay so that it waits 10 seconds before a photo is taken and before an alert is generated. If you want it to trigger an output, again, you simply select which output. In this case, let's say outputs 1 and 2. You can set that through the check boxes. And that's how you add a wired door sensor in your settings. So as you can see, we have 4 digital inputs on the Barnacle. As I mentioned, they can be used for bilge pumps and wired accessories. The most common is the bilge pumps, so that if you'd like to monitor up to 5 bilge pumps, that would mean that you use our dedicated bilge input plus 4 of the digital inputs alongside the DC relays. If you wanted to add more wired sensors, like a wired motion sensor, a wired door sensor, you simply need to configure it through these digital inputs here. After the digital inputs is the heel monitoring. The heel monitoring is the side-to-side port and starboard motion on your vessel. That is assuming that your Barnacle is mounted pointing either looking aft or looking forward. If your Barnacle is mounted on a port or starboard side pointed either way, that means that your pitch and heel are going to be reversed. But we're going to assume that you've mounted your Barnacle on a bulkhead pointing towards the aft of your boat. Now we've got monitoring and alerting turned on. You can set it to be named heel. Some people prefer roll, but we're going to leave it as heel in this case. If you want to monitor in decimal places, you can set that up. I prefer to set it to 0 decimal places. The maximum angle is commonly set for a sailboat. It's 35 and -35. But if you're in a boat where you don't expect it to be moving side to side very much, you can set it to be much lower, like say 5 degrees. So you simply go and set it to +5 and -5, and then you'll be able to monitor if it goes over or under by 5 degrees on the heel. So next up is humidity monitoring. We monitor humidity on board a boat to make sure that we don't have mold, and we also want to make sure that it's comfortable for those that are on board. So to turn on humidity monitoring, simply ensure that monitor is turned on and alert is turned on. You can name it whatever you'd like. Decimal places, I prefer 0 decimal places because what's the difference between 50.5 and 50? I couldn't tell you the difference. Offset, if you do have an external humidity monitor somewhere on board, you can set an offset just so that they match perfectly. Then the maximum value, generally above 65% relative humidities when you're going to start growing mold on board. So I like to set it to, say, 65%. Then the minimum value, you can set it to 10% just to make sure it's not too dry on board. This is, of course, very important if it's a wooden boat or if you've got a lot of wooden accessories on board. You could even set it to be slightly higher depending on the type of wood that you have. But 10% is when people are starting to get a little bit uncomfortable on board. So next is impact monitoring. The Barnacle has a built-in accelerometer and gyroscope so that you can detect if there's a sudden impact on your vessel. This is all monitored in G's. So to enable this, simply turn on monitor, turn on alerts. You can change the name, but we leave it as impact typically. 1 decimal place is generally fine. And then I have it set here to 0.1 Gs, but it's by default set to 2 Gs. If you want to set it more sensitive, I recommend leaving the barnacle on your boat for a day or so to understand what type of impact is normal on board your boat. Generally, the barnacle will report 0 Gs of impact when a boat's at a marina or at anchor. But if you are seeing some slight impacts, you might want to set it to like a 0.5 Gs just so that you don't get false alarms. A 1 G impact is a pretty severe impact. I have seen quite a few 2 G impacts on a powerboat when they're bashing through the waves. But the impact monitor is great if you're wanting to understand if your boat's secured properly to the dock, and it's great to know if a neighbor bumps into you while you're moored or at the dock as well. So the legacy version of Barnacle was called the All-in-One, and it actually came with a built-in motion sensor, and that's what this motion sensor is meant for here in our Barnacle settings. Now, we don't have the motion sensor built into the Barnacle external camera version, where the camera itself is about the size of an egg and is on its own cable. So 99% chance that you don't have this version, since we only sold it around 2018. So make sure that you have monitor and alert turned off, as they don't actually do anything on your version of Barnacle. Next is our pitch angle monitoring. It's the exact same as our heel monitor, except it's doing the front to back monitoring if you have the barnacle mounted on a bulkhead where you're either pointing forward or aft. If you did mount the barnacle on a port or starboard side bulkhead where it's looking side to side, then this will actually be your heel angle. But again, pitch angle set default with 1 decimal place and the maximum and minimum being 35 degrees. If you'd like to monitor if your boat pitches their heels about 10 degrees, which is a bit more common, then you could set the maximum and minimum to 10 degrees. Next in line is the shore power monitoring. This requires you to have an external shore power sensor. We have both a pluggable and a hardwired shore power connection that's available through the Barnacle shop or through one of our certified dealers. Now, in the app, you want to make sure that monitoring is turned on, alerting is turned on, name by default is shore power, high name by default connected, disconnected for low, and then alerting on low. You could set up a delay, which I don't recommend for shore power. You could turn on photo on alert and you could turn on an output. Usually this is used only if the shore power input is being used for a different purpose. Now, one of those other purposes would be a laser sensor. Now, this input is a high switching input, and a laser sensor, as you can imagine, if someone's walking through a laser beam, might trigger very quickly. So we recommend, if you do have a laser sensor, use this shore power input. Now I'm going to go through how you can configure this shore power input for a laser. First, change the name from shore power, since it obviously isn't shore power anymore, and then change it to laser. Next, the high name. This is generally when everything is okay. So the laser is actually an active low. So it sits high all the time because the laser beam is reflecting and sitting high. Now, if someone walks through it, it will go low. So the high name is going to be okay. Then the low name we could name as, let's say, intruder. And we want to have this set up on low. Now the delay time. Now this is very important because all our Barnacle inputs delay by default to a half a second. But that might be too long for when you're detecting a person walking through a laser beam. So I recommend 0.05 as the value. That's 50 milliseconds. Next, you probably want to have a photo on alert if the laser beam has been broken. And then an output, you could have an output 1, output 2, depending on if you have a siren or strobe light attached to one of the Barnacle outputs. Hit OK, then hit save. That's how you configure a laser sensor in the Barnacle app. All right, so the last two built-in settings within the Barnacle are temperature and calibration. So the temperature setting, again, turn on monitor, turn on alert. You can set your preferred unit between Celsius and Fahrenheit. And as well, you can add decimal places. I typically don't like to have decimal places with my temperature, but it's totally up to you. Offset, if you have a thermostat or a thermometer or something on board that's already reading your temperature, you can always add an offset so that it matches what you would see in the Barnacle app versus what you're seeing on that display. For us, maximum temperature, 30 degrees Celsius is probably pretty low. Let's say that we want to get an alert if it's over 50 degrees Celsius. And then minimum temperature 0, we want to make sure that we know when it's beginning to freeze on board our boat. So we will set up alerts with maximum of 50 and a minimum of 0. Now the last is calibration. This is the calibration for our accelerometer on board the Barnacle. So you want to make sure that your Barnacle is mounted and secured in its final place on board your boat. Then you'll hit the calibrate button, and what this does is the Barnacle will automatically figure out the direction of gravity. So if you've got your Barnacle mounted sideways, upside down, or whatever, it will figure that out automatically within the Barnacle, and it will set everything to 0 for your pitch, heel, and impact. If you then tilt your Barnacle side to side, you will then see your heel change relative to that new position. If you move it forward and back, then you will see that relative on your pitch. If you suddenly shake it, you will then see a notification about impact based on that current position. Now, if you've added some wireless sensors to your system, you're going to see them all listed here below the calibrate button. So first, we have a key fob that I've added to the system. This is where you can name your key fob. In my case, I put Brandon's key fob. With the keypad, you can set the name if you've got multiple keypads, and this is where you can change the pin for that keypad. Next, we have a wireless motion sensor on board the boat. So we want to turn on monitoring, we want to turn on alerts. High name defaults to alert, low name okay. Then output on alert, we can set it up so that it turns on a siren, turns on strobe lights if you have that connected. You'll notice that we don't actually have take photo on alert as a setting on here on the screen. That's because all wireless sensors automatically take photos based on an event. So if you've got 2 cameras, both cameras are going to take a photo on an event with any of these wireless sensors. Next, we have a wireless multi-purpose sensor. This is just one of many wireless door sensors that we have attached to this boat, but we have monitoring turned on, alerts turned on. We named it Studio Door. High name is open, low name is closed, and then we can output on alert so that we could turn on a siren or a strobe light. Next, we have a wireless water leak sensor. The default again, monitoring turned on, alerts turned on. Rename it, alert, high, low, okay. The output on alert could be a siren or strobe lights. So we have a section down below for global settings. This is the keypad global settings where we have an entry and exit delay for our keypads. Now this means that once you open a door on board, you will have an entry delay so that the siren or strobe lights don't go off immediately. By default, it's set to 30 seconds, and you can see here that we have a 45-second delay so that when a door is open, you will hear a beep for 45 seconds. Then after 45 seconds, if the system isn't disarmed, the siren will go off. I hope you enjoyed this settings overview video. If you do have questions or you'd like us to help you through a custom setup on your boat, call our 1-877 number. We're more than happy to walk you through a demo of the app and to help customize everything specific for your boat. Happy sailing.